All right. Well, welcome Monty, Jim, and Lynette to our Resilient Food System Infrastructure Office Hours Q&A for today. This is the second one we had scheduled, and I think probably the last one we will do simply because the phase one applications are due in a few days here. I'm Brian Copham, the Colorado Agricultural Future Loan Program Manager, and am also managing the Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grant, otherwise known as RFSI. And I am joined by my colleague Jody Walder, who is program coordinator and will have a large role to play in this grant as well. And then we are also joined by Lynette Garcia, who is our interpreter for today. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynette so she can talk a little bit about her role and give some instructions. And if there's any reason that we have somebody joining who needs a repeat of that, we'll manage that at that time. And Lynette, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Brian. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you all to Thank you to all who has joined us today. The organizers of the space have committed to making sure that everyone in the space can hear and connect in the language of their heart. Ahora, primero que nada, los organizadores de este espacio por asegurarse de que todos puedan comunicarse y entender el idioma de su corazón. What that means is that we will have simultaneous interpretation here, lo que significa que vamos a tener interpretación simultánea. One kind reminder to our speakers, please be aware of your pace. Spanish is 15 to 20% longer than English. So if at any point I jump back in here and I start doing this to you all, this means that you're speaking too fast. I want to capture every word by word, every emotion that is being said. A los organizadores de este espacio, los facilitadores, les recuerdo, por favor, que el español es 15 a 20% veces más largo que el inglés. Entonces, les voy a hacer esta señal aquí. Si les hago eso, significa que están hablando demasiado rápido para mí. Quiero poder capturar cada palabra y cada emoción que se esté compartiendo. If you are joining us via a tablet or a cell phone, make sure that you select the three little dots to the right where there's a drop-down button and select interpretation there. A las personas que están aquí por celular o tableta, por favor les informo que se ve un poquito diferente la interpretación. Van a ver 3 puntitos a la derecha donde pueden seleccionar el idioma de su corazón allí. And please make sure that you silence the audio as well. Sometimes you can hear both interpretation and original audio. Play around with it and see what feels better for you. Some folks like to hear interpretation and the original audio, some folks don't. So find your best feature there. A las personas que están también aquí, les aconsejo que jueguen un poquito con el silenciar el audio o no, escuchar la interpretación y el audio original. Depende de lo que a ustedes les guste mejor. And I think that is it. Let's go ahead and turn interpretation on. Vamos a aprender la interpretación, por favor.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us. This is really your time to ask your questions about the Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grant and your Phase 1 application. There are no specific updates of our own that we will share at this time outside of that the grant is due at the end of day on March 7th, which is 3 days from now. And we are ready and willing to answer your questions, provided we have those answers. If we do not have the answers, then we will check in with the AMS, look it up, do what we need to, and email you with that answer. So does anybody want to open it up?
I've got a question.
Go for it, Monty.
Okay, first question that I have is on item number 24 on the application. It asks about, do we need any help with the cost for technical assistance to support submitting the grant? And it says through the Northwest and Rocky Mountain Regional Food Business Center. So the question I had is that something that once we get to phase 2, is it a very easy process to get that support, or is it a whole grant application process that's going to take many, many hours to write to get that grant support? Or is it like a mini grant or a very simple grant? What's the scope of that program?
The Regional Food Business Center is a new endeavor, and they have agreed to contribute $2,000 to any of the phase one applicants who are eligible to apply for phase two to help with paying for a grant writer.
Okay,
Before I get to the application process, I'll say that question 24 is really designed to help us and the Regional Food Business Center understand what kind of needs you may have in case you don't have a provider already. If you do, you can list them, and essentially what CSU will do, because this will go through CSU, is onboard them as a vendor. The application is not designed yet, but the intention is that it will be very simple, something like I'm applying for the phase two of the Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grant. I've received an email from CDA saying that I'm eligible to apply. I would like to get funding. And I expect, if anything, you can just pull data from the phase one application for that application.
okay, and then on the phase two application, so this one seems pretty streamlined. And
Yes.
the phase two, is it like a bear, or is it pretty tough, writing that next grant? Or I'm trying to figure out how much energy I can put into this first one. I'll have it out probably by tomorrow.
Yeah.
But then the second one, I just don't know how much work it's going to take as an individual. Or is it better I invest in this grant writer to help with that?
I would recommend that you apply for the funding for the grant writer. It'll probably take you 10 minutes to fill out the application to get the funding for the phase two, the $2,000. And the phase two application is somewhat straightforward, but it is a federal USDA application. So for instance, if you don't have one already, you will have to get a unique entity identifier number from sam.gov, and the grant writer could help you with that. There are ways of answering the questions which are perhaps more familiar to the USDA and the AMS, which grant writers will often know kind of how to frame your narrative or what to highlight in your project to really make sure that the evaluators understand what you're doing. Marty, Monty, I don't think it's onerous, but it will be somewhat time consuming. I highly recommend you get the funding and see if you can get someone to help, because then you can share the narrative from phase one, which phase one, it's streamlined, and all of the questions were taken from the phase two application.
Mm-hmm.
So the intention was you could use that content directly in the phase two, or at least to help your grant writer understand what you're doing, the scope of what you're doing, and they can start to ask the questions to flesh that out for the full application.
Okay, and then the other question I had was on questions 16 and 18. Those are the narratives, or two of the narratives where you have to explain some things. Are you guys looking for a page or two explaining what we're wanting to do, or is this?
No.
Or is
No.
this?
Paragraph or two.
Oh, okay, that's easy enough. That
Yes.
makes it easier. Okay, and then my last question was, I was looking at like the eligible costs and everything, or things you can spend funds on, but what I was wondering in particular, we're looking at organics, going into organics, and cost for consultants. So like we're thinking of, we already have the FDA registry, but then we might need help with getting our organic certifications through either CDA or through like another source. Can we use the funds for that piece of it?
I believe so, because it is directly related to the processing.
Okay. And then the last piece of that is, one of the things that we wanted to do was work with other nonprofits and groups to help set up some meetings or dinners, educational forums for farmers or producers to come in so they can listen to, someone from CDA, someone from the Rodell Institute to explain the process of going organic, taking your field, the 3-year process to going from conventional to organics, just so that we're doing our part to help market it. So if we're wanting to buy those products and transload those products, process those products or commodities, we should be trying to encourage the producers to grow more as well. And so are we able to use the funds for that piece of it to, like if we put in $10,000 and we're going to do 3 area meetings with producers, with CDA's organics people, and maybe like the Rodell Institute to come in and talk about how, the pros and cons, or how do you become an organic farmer?
Probably not an allowable cost because it's more directly related to production than it is processing.
Okay.
But it may be a cost that you could apply for through the Regional Food Business Center for what's called a business builder grant. And you can think of those as really being related to technical assistance.
Yeah.
And so that may be a good fit for that kind of activity, is to have a business builder grant fund that.
Okay. Those are my questions for now.
Great. I'm sure you'll come up with some more. Jim, David, or Teresa, how about you?
Yeah, this is Jim. I have a question on the funding nature of this grant. If we apply for a project that's already receiving federal grant funds, can we combine this grant with that project?
Yes.
It is a processing facility, by the way, that we're looking at.
You can apply for funds from RFSI for that project. You cannot use federal funding as a match for your RFSI funding. You can use state funding or private donations or in-kind for a match, but not federal funding. And in terms of applying for RFSI on a project that's already federally funded, that's okay. But you're going to want to talk about how the RFSI grant would achieve more beyond what your original project had anticipated. So I'm going to try to explain that a little bit. The USDA wants RFSI funds to create new activity. So if somebody already had planned on, say, building out a grain milling operation, they received a federal grant for it, they showed that they had the match to finish the project. It would be nice to have the RFSI money to offset some of that other money that they had committed themselves, but it's not creating new activity beyond what was originally planned. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Specifically, what came to mind when you were giving me that explanation. If you use, say, the federal funds to help purchase a facility, you could then use the RFSI funds perhaps to purchase some of the processing equipment.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Or vice versa. I mean, if you're using the federal grants to get equipment, can RFSI be used to purchase a building?
You
Or even
cannot
to lease
purchase
it?
a building.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
sorry. The RFSI is wanting to create new infrastructure rather than change ownership of existing infrastructure. So you can upgrade a building, you can build a building, but you can't buy a building.
Okay,
But you
well, that's good to
could,
know.
for instance, Jim, in your example, you could buy a building and then use RFSI funds to upgrade the building or renovate it.
Okay. All right. And then this seems I think I know the answer to this, but just in case I don't, what if, so right now, what we've applied for the federal funds, was to process dry goods. If we expanded the process to include something like an oil seed press and we could start squeezing seeds for oil, it's an expanded use. It's still a processing.
Yep.
Does that sound like something that makes sense to you that you could take RFSI money to do?
Yes.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
because that's beyond the scope of your original federal grant application.
Yeah. Okay. That's why. So that's the way I interpreted it. I just thought I'd make
Yep.
sure.
You got it.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet. Teresa, I know you and Jim were neck and neck on unmuting, so I'll let you go ahead and ask.
Oh, thank you. I have a couple of questions similar to what he was asking. When you're talking about infrastructure, you did answer one of my questions, if funds could be used to renovate an existing structure that I own into a processing facility. And secondly, with renovation, what options could be included? Like, could a leach field, septic field be included, or plumbing, or none of that?
No, that's all allowable as long as it's directly related to the processing
Right,
capacity. Yes.
for sure. And then basic question on the actual funds. When it says the amount that you're asking for, is the grant funding that you're asking for, is that the total amount, or is that the amount that I intend to match?
That would be the easiest way to think of it is it's whatever portion of your project cost you're going to ask the grant to provide.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Those were my two big questions, other than advice on how to write it. And I appreciate the advice on getting the grant writer too. That's good advice. So,
Yeah. And the phase one hopefully is somewhat intuitive in terms of the narrative. It's a good opportunity to develop your sales pitch, which
Mhm.
really is about it's not so much about the why we need processing. The reason the USDA has put this money out there is because they know there's an absence of infrastructure in the middle, whether it's processing or storage or distribution. It's really more about how will this specific project contribute to a strengthened food system by adding this infrastructure where it currently doesn't exist. And
Right.
strong applications are those that will demonstrate that they serve a number of farmers farmers. I would get in the habit of saying farmers and ranchers, but farmers,
Mhm.
and that there's demand for this. You've spoken with farmers, you know, they're like, yes, absolutely, please do this. We're begging you. We'll sign letters. We'll, you know, as soon as you build it, I've got X amount of produce or product that I'm going to put into the chain, knowing that is smaller in the beginning and it grows over time, but really thinking about that impact.
Right. And describing that.
Describing that, that's right. So what I try to tell people is don't tell, show. So the difference is telling is like it's going to have a big impact on a lot of farmers. Showing is it is going to create a new market channel worth $5 million for 3 farmers that are already invested in it. So it's kind of like how our math teachers always said, show your work. It's not about the answer. It's about showing your work. So show your work and it'll be a good application. And phase one doesn't have to be terribly technical, but it'll be helpful to show that work.
Super. Thank you.
You
Appreciate
bet. David.
Yeah. Is it a good application if you want to do 12 things? Like I want to freeze sweet corn and I want to make oil and I want to roast seeds and I want to make coffee and I want to freeze green beans and dice butternut squash and and et
Well,
cetera, et cetera?
yeah, I would suggest that activities be organized under a central concept. So it might be, we are building a value-added processing center for Colorado farmers. So we're going to be able to puree peaches. We're going to be able to strip corn. We're going to be able to press seed oil. We're going to, whatever those activities are. There is an assumed amount of expertise under each one of those, as well as a assumed amount of resources that need to go into the supply chain, identifying the supply chain. So I think if you're too spread out, somebody would question, how are you going to be talking with the peach growers as well as the corn growers, as well as the wheat growers, as well as the getting commitments from them, getting contracts in place, installing your equipment, training people on it. And of course, it depends on scale as well and the nature of the equipment. But you'll just want to be able to tell a good story of how you can actually effectively pull off 7 businesses versus one concentration.
And putting that in a single application, if it's coherent, would it be better to do a single one or do 3 applications, one for sweet corn and run one for that, and kind of, split your risk? Maybe one gets funded and one doesn't, but if you've got 3 in one and you lose it, you lost all 3. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. So let's see, what I would be inclined to do is say, submit a single application with your strongest idea. On these applications, you're going to want to be deep and not wide. So you'll want to demonstrate that you have the skill, knowledge, wherewithal, experience, and resources needed outside of any grant award to take a project from, let's say in this case, concept, all the way through execution, the hard stages of a new idea, the difficult stages of a new idea, and bring it out in a sustainable way. And if having this kind of multi-product approach is part of that, if that's the strongest application, submit that. If I would just really, I'm very wary. I don't know, not knowing the concept, it's hard to say, but I'm wary of really spreading yourself too thin, because I do think that there's a lot of individual expertise that potentially falls in each sector of that agricultural production. So I'm going to have to, Jim, I'm going to have to leave it to your instinct on that one. But you definitely want to demonstrate, I'm the guy, or I lead the group, or whatever it is, and we've got the Jack Welch of agriculture in our group, and we're ready to go, and we know we can execute it for these reasons. David, sorry. David, did that help?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. And Monty, I see you have your hand raised. God bless you.
Yeah, just a couple more questions came up. One is some of the equipment that we're looking at is pretty pricey, but I think I found some outlets where I can get newer used items. If part of your package is needing equipment, are you allowed to get used equipment, or you have to buy new equipment, or how does that?
No, you can get used equipment. It's unlike, say, if you're getting an FSA loan,
Mhm.
And the bank wants you to buy a new tractor because they know how to sell a new tractor if something goes wrong, but they don't know what the value of a used tractor is, so they just prefer new.
Yeah, because I know that there's some leasing companies, they have leased equipment, and then if you contact them, they'll watch for them, and then when they have one returned, they'll call you and say, hey, for 60%, you can get what you need. Now, if
Yeah.
it was a really, really critical piece of equipment that if it goes down, you're in a bind, I'd probably go brand new. But some of these things in the agricultural world, you don't need brand new when you're going to use that equipment like one time a week, every other week. So
Yeah.
I'm glad there's flexibility there. So that's good news. There's one other question. I can't remember what it is now. All right, I'll see if I can remember our next question.
Okay, and we'll follow up on that equipment question. I I want to make sure that the USDA or the AMS doesn't have any particular thoughts on that outside of what I shared with you. Certainly at the CDA, we recognize that used equipment could be a much more efficient way to manage an operation. I will say, depending on the difference that you're talking about, and depending on how many applications we get, what the overall request is for funding that's eligible. So let's say we get requests for 12 million in funding from eligible applications, and 50% of those are high quality projects. So now we've got 6 million. So we're going to have to figure out whether I think most likely we will at least attempt to come back to grantees and say, what is it you want and what is it you need in order to make the impact that you want to make? And, potentially negotiate like, okay, instead of going new, let's go used on that. So that is one way of saying you may want to, if it's not a huge difference, I mean, if it's a 40% difference on a $500,000 piece of equipment, maybe you just put in the used. But if your instinct is, I'll put it in new in case I need to come down on it or give something else up, then that I would probably go that way, use that strategy.
Is the review process, is that CDA makes their recommendations to the USDA and then they typically will take your recommendations? Or do they scrutinize it again after your recommendations?
They're typically going to take our recommendations. What they will do is scrutinize it for compliance, any concerns they might have about pricing or value, redundancy potentially. But I think the process with the USDA is going to be more about ensuring that any application that is recommended is compliant with their program, is achieving the outcomes that the USDA wants to achieve, and has the elements that the USDA needs in order for them to do their reporting and all the other things they're going to have to manage.
And then on the 25% match or 50% match, is there the ability to do any in kind?
Yes.
Okay.
There's no limit on in kind.
And then when do you explain how you're going to do your in kind? Is that in the second application?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
A detailed budget will be provided in the second application.
Okay, super. And then timeline, if when you from CDA, when you give your recommendations to the USDA and they do their scrub and then they say, yes, we're going to fund these projects, what's like a timeline of how long it takes to receive funds? Because some of this equipment, they need 2 months, 4 months, 6 months of lead time. So is it couple of months, 3 months? For how long would you guess before awards would happen and funding was there? And is the funding reimbursement or is it money up front so you can buy? Because in some cases, if you get the money afterwards, you've got to go through financing to
Yes.
get the equipment. So how is that going to work?
I expect 6 to 8 weeks for the USDA to turn around their final approvals after we've gone back and forth on proposals. Right now, I'm expecting that middle to late July, we will have awards announced. And contracts should be just a couple weeks behind that, pretty close to that schedule. So that's really kind of the beginning of summer, right? So early summer, you should be able to start make commitments and things like that. In terms of it's a reimbursement grant. And I know that there are cash flow issues with all grants where you get any, particularly when they're larger, you get a large award and then you got to figure out how to come up with the cash. So there will try to be creative with supporting how we can help producers get equipment under contract and be able to then get money quickly to them on that reimbursement basis. But I think financing is going to be your friend. It'll be short-term financing. CDA will actually be doing the reimbursements. So we should be able to, if invoices are well documented, not extraordinarily long, and accurate, we can turn around an invoice in a couple of weeks to get payment initiated. Where we've been struggling with invoices is when we get a 97-page invoice with $3 at Ace Hardware and $247 at Home Depot, and all of those need to be vetted, checked, double checked, and it really extends the time period. But when you're looking at these large pieces of equipment, I think we can hopefully work with grantees to make sure that that's not a burden, but it is in fact a benefit.
Yeah, from the agricultural viewpoint, I was thinking of timelines and probably most of those who are going to bring in new lines or something, harvest time for farmers, it's going to be pretty much wrapped up for this whole year by the time you get funding. So a lot of this might be next year type purchases and everything, because you typically don't want to, while you're receiving all these different commodities from farmers, you don't want to try building and everything at the same time. You don't have the storage capacity either in some cases. So there might be some challenges there with timelines and so I guess I would just also check whether the financing that we do now, if we're awarded, if we finance equipment now or lease equipment, just making sure that later on, if we are awarded, that we can just pay off the loan for that piece of equipment, that there's not going to be any hiccups there.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about the timing. I wouldn't expect people to be able to start using whatever investments they've made until sometime next season at the earliest.
Yeah. Most of our farmers and the products we get, they'll be coming in September, October. So if we were lucky, we might be able to pull off part of our plans, but not all.
Yeah. And the project does go through May of 2027, so they're anticipating some long-term timelines may be necessary.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You bet. Teresa?
Find my mute button. Thanks. My question is similar to what Monty was saying and what I was kind of thinking out loud with equipment and understanding that nothing can be spent until the grant is awarded, and that's July. And also thinking about harvest season, if I was to order a piece of equipment after my application And then if it was granted, would that be potentially eligible for part of the match? With me understanding that maybe it wouldn't be granted.
Yes, so I have a question in front of the AMS right now to verify. We are expecting that pre-award expenses up to 90 days before the award will be allowable for reimbursement or match on the grant.
Okay, that's perfect. So 90 days puts us at
Yeah, and
1 or so.
we are getting confirmation from that with the agricultural marketing service.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. I know that it's all, up in the air at this point, but hypothetically, it's good to hear your opinion, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And what's important to RFSI, much like with the earlier discussion that we were having, is that any pre-award spending that would be claimed against the grant is the result of somebody essentially discovering this grant and saying, great, there's something I've been wanting to do and I haven't been able to do it. This will help. And, I'm going to go for it. We're going to make these investments because I think it's really important versus, great, here's more funding that might offset what I would otherwise personally spend.
Well, my situation is, working together with Boulder Valley School District and really wanting to supply them with some items that they can use that they're not getting yet. And
Yeah.
so I'm interested in purchasing a commercial greens washer, which are not cheap, and want to do that. But if I was able to get the grant, I could build out a larger processing kitchen that would benefit other farmers as well. So it would be
Yes.
creating something new. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking about purchasing this greens washer to move myself forward and maybe other farmers too.
Yeah. And in that case, I think the greens washer, for instance, would, assuming they are going to let us do the 90 days, would be eligible.
Yeah, for the match. And then if I wasn't given a grant, then I could at least, still use it for what, the intended purpose is. So,
Yeah,
okay. Thank you.
you bet.
Just
Any other,
just a couple
Brian?
more questions if now's a good time.
Now's great.
Okay. I pulled it up on my screen here so I remember what it said. There was something in the sort of frequently asked questions information that talked about here it is. Phase 1 applicants may also benefit from receiving clarifying feedback on their projects that could be helpful if they pursue Phase 2 applications. So if we do a Phase 1 application and submit it, I assume you could be eliminated because you just, based on the way you answered the questions, you just missed the criteria. If you're not eliminated, would you automatically receive feedback? Is that like a just going to be in the process, or is it just dependent on your application?
I think what we would expect, Jim, is that what we're really going to check for first is eligibility. So for instance, we have a few applications where one of them, somebody's hoping to buy a greenhouse. And that's just not an eligible use. So they will get a polite email that says, we've reviewed your application, the use is not eligible. Thank you for your time and interest in this, and we'll let you know if something comes along that fits that need. Beyond that, then where projects are eligible for the RFSI, then what we will want to do is get an idea of the strength of that application based on what we're seeing. So even an ineligible applicant in Phase 1 can still say, you know what, I'm going to put in a Phase 2 application.
Okay.
So everybody can get a Phase 2 application in if they want. Our intention is to make most efficient use of people's time by saying, one, hey, you're not eligible, so it's not really worth filling all that out. Two, there's some weaknesses in the application that are going to make it unlikely to be funded in light of the other applications that are in. And what we can do is say, here's what those are, and here's ways you might want to address that, because we do want to be cognizant of there's a difference between how to write an application well and a project that really meets the objectives of the program. So I think we'll be providing feedback to everybody who's eligible and has an interest in applying in phase 2.
Okay, appreciate that answer. And then just a clarification point on the phase 1 questionnaire. I think, yeah, it's in item 4. It explicitly says in a parenthetical phrase, it says after harvest and before retail. It wants to make sure your project addresses that. Am I interpreting it correctly that if in your process you would envision having, in addition to the middle of the supply chain, you also have retail sales of your product? Is that a negative?
No, not selling at retail, but if you want to build out a retail store, that's not eligible.
Okay. Gotcha. Perfect. I'm glad I asked you that. Okay.
And there's actually in the Venn diagram between middle of the supply chain and retail, in that little intersection, there's things like a cooler. So a grocery store applying for a cooler would not be eligible because the cooler is storing product for distribution to the customer. A distributor asking for a cooler to store product to distribute to the grocery store is eligible because that cooler is in the middle of the supply chain, not at the end of the supply chain. So there's a few
if we're
nuances.
selling to, sorry, I interrupted you. If
No,
we're
that's
selling
okay.
to retailers, that's okay. But if we're
Yeah.
the point of retail sale and our equipment is to facilitate that retail sale, that's when we run into not fulfilling the objective. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and it's not binary. It's not like a food hub, for instance, would
Right.
they have a lot of aggregation is one of the things that they do. And aggregation is an important function in that supply chain. So depending on how the application is written, that could be considered middle of the supply chain.
Okay. All right. It's more nuanced than I was interpreting it then.
It's unfortunate, yes, because there is a lot of nuance, and there has been a fair amount of discussion between the Agricultural Marketing Service and states, the various states, on what's allowed, such as food hubs are kind of in that critical spot where they perform a number of different functions for small and mid-sized growers to have more access to the market. So is that retail activity or is it middle of the supply chain because they're allowing producers to aggregate product and then create some offering for an end customer?
Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thanks.
You bet. David, did anything else pop up for you?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great.
I guess, yeah, I'll throw it out. I'm cogitating. Selling to a school district? Are you a retailer or?
No. No, that would be considered business to business. So that would not be considered retail activity as much as it would be considered distribution activity. You're effectively a wholesaler at that point.
David, are you in Boulder County or somewhere else?
I'm in Western Colorado.
Oh,
I'm Olathe, sweet corn. Yeah, but I considered trying to sell direct sweet corn, which I sell to Boulder County some sweet corn school district, but it's kind of a strange thing to think about. And I don't know what business to business means, and retail, I'm not that smart, but it's a strange nexus of who you can and can't sell to. So I couldn't buy a semi truck to deliver sweet corn to sell on a street corner. But if I had a guy on a street corner who was a fruit stand, then I could buy the truck to deliver the corn to him, if I'm not mistaken.
You're definitely hitting on some of the nuance there. So I would say, yes, you're correct. So for sure, it would not fund the construction of a corner farm stand for you to sell sweet corn out of. However, provided that a corner farm stand existed, it would fund distribution to that corner farm stand, because that corner farm stand is your customer, but they're selling retail, which is to the end user.
Oh.
But
Okay.
school system, you should be all gravy. That should be good.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, and related to my situation, so a van or a truck to help after processing the value added items to help bring it to the school system would be a reasonable ask, maybe?
Yes, it would be. The one thing that you're going to want to be aware of is that it really needs to be specialty equipment. So a refrigerated truck, for instance, or a freezer truck is definitely allowable. A general van may not be allowable because it can be used for a lot of different things.
I was thinking
Versus-
of a van, like a catering van that has a refrigeration unit on the top and the whole inside is refrigerated, because I guess a refrigerated box truck would also be an option, depending on the
Yeah,
scale.
if it's refrigerated, it would be considered specialty. They don't have to worry that you're hauling the kids back and forth from soccer in it.
No, 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 that would not be the case. Maybe I'll just say a refrigerated vehicle that in the early stages, the refrigerated vehicle would certainly be a quality thing that would be valuable in the process. Thank you.
Yeah, you should be good with that. And that's where, again, a grant writer can also help shape that language. Well, it is 5:51. If you don't have other questions, you won't hurt our feelings if you say goodnight and drop off. But we're happy to answer anything else that you may have.
I do have one question. How competitive is this? How many applications do you get? Just curious.
Right now, we have 22 phase 1 applications.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I don't know how much money is collectively being asked in that.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. All of you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You bet, Jim. Good to see you. Thanks, David. Jody, I think we can probably.
Jody, creo que ya podemos.
Oh, I think I just switched over. I'm gonna cut the recording real quick.
Thank you, y'all. Have a good one.
Thank you, Lynette. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
being
Lynette.
here.
Thank